Good afternoon, Dr. Sanchez and classmates. Today I'm going to discuss authentic leadership and its role in building a successful remote work team. In today's presentation, we will cover what authentic leadership is, going over a background and selected literature. I'll then provide an overview of trends in remote work as they relate to team development. We will then go into a case study on Hesperian Health Guides, a nonprofit organization in Berkeley, California. Finally, we will wrap up with a discussion and recommendations for remote work environments. So to begin with the background and selected studies. What is authentic leadership? Authentic leadership was first introduced by Bill George, a Harvard scholar, in 2003. It's now considered the gold standard for leadership and has undergone several revisions and iterations since initial publication in 2003, the latest revision in 2015. George proposes 5 dimensions of authentic leadership. They are purpose, values, relationships, self-discipline, and heart. George professes that for a leader to be authentic, they must have a clearly defined sense of purpose. They must go into their leadership capacity examining why they want to do so, why they want to lead, and what they have to offer. From there, they must develop a clear set of values that they not only profess as values, but that they live by and lead by on a daily basis. Authentic leaders need to have long-standing relationships. These relationships are based off of others' perceptions of the leader as authentic, and they transcend job changes, moves, different organizational affiliations. They travel with the authentic leader and allow that person to become even more effective because of their relationships and their network. George proposes that the authentic leader has a strong sense of self-discipline. They are able to constantly assess and correct their behavior to make sure that they are in accordance with their values and their purpose. Finally, George emphasizes that authentic leaders have heart, and they lead by their heart. They are empathetic and compassionate towards their clients, their employees, and everybody that they come into interaction with. In the following section, we will highlight 3 studies from the literature that provide a valuable contribution to the argument for why authentic leadership is needed in remote work teams. Each of the following studies presents a unique viewpoint on authenticity and team building in uncertain contexts. This study, titled Authentic Leadership Effectiveness for Individuals and Teams, a Coaching Approach, was conducted by Tineke Wolfers in 2017. The objective of Wolfers' study was to place an argument for authentic leadership development in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous contexts, otherwise known as VUCA. The method of his study was a holistic review of peer-reviewed studies from 2005 onward. And around 2005 is when the focus of authentic leadership really started to skyrocket, in large part due to some negative outcomes that were in the news at the time, Enron and things like that. Wolfers suggests that leadership interventions such as coaching can spur progression of authentic leadership. Now, in this suggestion, Wolfers discusses the concept of the LDL, or the leadership development levels. Now, Wolfers suggests a leadership authenticity process that begins with self-clarity around one's personal authentic leadership compass, identifying one's goals, values, identity, beliefs, and psychological attributes. The second stage in Wolfer's leadership authenticity process is an ability to self-regulate to comply with that AL compass. As you can see, Wolfer's is in agreement with George's conceptualization of the authentic leader as having a strong value set as well as a strong sense of self-discipline to live according to that value set. Wolfer's work also builds off of Chan et al.'s 2005 studies of the phenomenological self, which allows for internal existential examination, allowing somebody to ask the questions of why they are where they are, how they've gotten there, and how they can make changes to their leadership style to improve if needed. Wolfer's LDL approach and his leadership authenticity process is temporal and dynamic. The leader has to constantly reassess their own authentic leadership at its current state and as well as be thinking about projections for their future state of authentic leadership. It is not a static set of values that guides the authentic leader, in other words. It is a continual iterative process that the leader has to conduct on a regular basis, and they have to be in tune with their own set of values to be able to conduct that self-examination regularly. Now, the leadership development level is a measurable capacity related to how a leader relates to others, to situations, and themselves. It is not about what the person knows, but how they understand their surroundings. New experiences that confront a person's worldview serve as catalysts to propel the individual to the next level of authentic leadership. Wolfer's differentiates LDL levels by 3 categories of experience: intrapersonal, interpersonal, and cognitive. Wolfer's argues that leaders progress in the intrapersonal sphere when one's self-concept transitions from externally defined to internally. As one moves up the LDL continuum, their interpersonal realm moves from being self-occupied to concern for others. Then, as the person moves on the highest stages of LDL, their cognitive understanding becomes increasingly complex and simple notions are rebutted. In this model, one cannot regress nor skip a level of development, but they can become stagnant or progress at a very slow pace in the face of challenges and how they respond to those challenges. LDL 5, the highest level, demands authenticity, but only 5 to 8% of adults aged 40 to 60 operate at this level. Wolfer suggests that leaders can continually progress so long as they are committed to self-reflection and growth. And in times of uncertainty, they should turn to interventions such as leadership coaching to spur internal examination of self. Progression must be measured through an ipsative approach that compares one's growth to their prior state, rather than a normative person-to-person approach under Wolfer's model. The next study we are going to take a look at is titled Leadership Values in Africa and Implications for Online Learning. This study was conducted by a Dutch and a Kenyan scholar in 2014. Their objective was to describe how traditional models of African leadership parallel with servant leadership theory, and how they can use those parallels to promote team development and cohesion for online learners in Africa. Now, this is extremely relevant to the topic of authentic leadership in remote work environments because she comes away with several findings regarding the parallels between servant leadership and authentic leadership. She also discovers parallels between servant leadership and Ubuntu leadership, a traditional African concept of leadership, as well as rare leadership, responsible, appropriate, responsible, accountable, relevant, and ethical, rare leadership. Now, the method they used for this study was a comprehensive examination of 3 leadership styles: Ubuntu, traditional African methods, rare, which we just discussed, and servant. Their suggestions include teaching providers of online learning to integrate servant leadership practices to build community, The authors discovered that in an online learning environment that served the learners, served their needs, was attuned to their psychological learning styles, resulted in better outcomes, and actually developed more authenticity in learner-professor interactions. Now, their results also indicated that similarities in traditional African leadership models and servant leadership were due to a shared sense of collectivism. The third study we are going to take a look at today is titled Living and Leading Through Uncertainty, Developing Leaders' Capability for Uncertainty. The objective of this study was to explain the importance of capability for uncertainty in leadership development programs. Again, this is speaking to that VUCA concept that we mentioned earlier, the ambiguous, uncertain, volatile situations that many of our business and organization transactions find themselves in today. The method for their study was in-depth qualitative research with a sample of executives at 2 companies and a separate sample of external executive coaches. Now, the lived experience of uncertainty by leaders in Company 1, which was the researcher's first study sample, had been going on for over 5 years. The second sample came from an organization that had been experiencing uncertainty for 18 months. And the researcher decided to combine those two into one sample due to concerns that the 5-year sample might have less relevant or less accurate recall because it had been such a long period of time, whereas the sample that had only been undergoing organizational uncertainty for 18 months would have a more immediate and more accurate recollection of their lived experience. So she combined those 2 samples and synthesized results from the 2. Her third sample was a group of executive coaches who work with leaders during periods of uncertainty. The authors interviewed the first 2 samples of leaders initially. They were all members of the executive committees in their organizations. She questioned these leaders on issues regarding their own retrospective, granted, experience of uncertainty during this time of organizational change, how they felt capable to respond to organizational uncertainty at that time, and what sort of resilience for uncertainty they developed through their experiences. In the second phase of her research, she turned to the sample of executive coaches. In this interview series with the coaches, she tried to examine how they interact with the demanding expectations of leaders, how these leaders balance being demanding for the need for these coaches' service while still retaining a sense of strength without becoming too vulnerable. Other research has shown that executives are favorably disposed to coaching because it is one-on-one. It's confidential with the leadership coach and affords them a little bit of safety for exploration and reflection. So the researchers believed that would be valuable to explore executive coaches' experiences, to hear another perspective rather than just something coming from the leader themselves, which may be a little tampered due to their own self-reflection with the researcher. Now we are going to move into section 2, which discusses trends in remote work and team development. So remote work is a rising trend. A recent study done by the organization Buffer, a corporate research body, found that 90% of remote workers plan to continue doing so for the rest of their careers. 88% of business owners surveyed have supported a remote work culture from the outset of their company's development. Both of these figures give the implication that remote work is not going away anytime soon. It's becoming more and more favorable with both employees and employers, and remote workers are likely to encourage their friends and colleagues to consider it as well. Organizations are having to grapple with the idea of remote work as a coveted benefit, as well as just a style of communicating in the office. Now, again, referring to that buffer industry survey, problems with remote work indicated loneliness at 21%, collaboration and communication also at 21%, and staying motivated at 14%. Those percentages are the percentages of total respondents who reported that issue being their top concern with remote work. Now, what this indicates is that there is a large potential for leadership interventions that can make remote work more enjoyable and more effective for employees. There are things that leaders can do to intervene on remote workers' perception of loneliness through implementing social virtual get-togethers, social media channels, networks that allow their remote workers to feel connected to the rest of the company. Several organizations that employ remote workers, such as Buffer themselves, do host either quarterly or annually meetups of all of their remote workers where they do get together in person in a chosen location and are able to have that social interaction that combats loneliness as well as productive work collaboration. So that kind of takes care of the first two issues in one. There are also interventions that leaders can do to help their employees stay motivated as they are working remotely. The authentic leader, through showing their own image of their dedication to work, of their experience and their passion for what they are doing, can influence their reports to feel the same sense of motivation for the organization. Our third section here is a case study into Hesperian Health Guides, a small nonprofit organization going through an uncertain period itself. Hesperian Health Guides is a nonprofit organization that produces health information for people worldwide who never have and never will have access to organized health systems. For many, the only access to health information they have comes from Hesperian's books and other publications. Where There Is No Doctor is the organization's flagship title, originally published in 1978 and updated regularly since then. Recently, Hesperian has begun to struggle with a severe decline in book sales. Leadership ascribes this to changes in the external environment, wherein organizations have become more inclined to develop their own proprietary materials while they may have purchased from Hesperian in the past. The organization has attempted to manage their external environment by advocating for the value of Hesperian's work, but book sales continue to decline. The organization is also facing a severe challenge in terms of raising funds for book development work. Donor institutions are seeking opportunities for their grants to be used in the field and do not always support Hesperian's request for funding content development. Hesperian is also facing internal conflict over the organization's value system. In 2011, Hesperian launched the Health Wiki, an online database of Hesperian's content. It was a very favorable project, but the leadership team did not necessarily think through the changes to business model that they would need to undertake once launching the Health Wiki. The organization still attempts to bring in revenue through book sales, but much of Hesperian's work is devoted to digitizing content, producing new online content, and developing online translations. This sort of values confusion is providing a deep sense of uncertainty for the leadership and employees of the organization to try and balance the demands for revenue from book sales as well as the demand of the mission to provide access to health information, which they are accomplishing through the online Health Wiki. So it's a very uncertain time, to say the least. Now, Hesperian is managed by a 4-person management team, which is made up of the executive director, who oversees the finance manager, the managing editor, and the digital projects manager, who each oversee their respective departments. The 4-person management team also has one member, the finance manager, who works remotely full-time from Germany. So it does make scheduling and decisions-making processes a bit more challenging due to the time zone difference and other logistics. Now, as I mentioned, Hesperian is undergoing a period of uncertainty in terms of their value system. The organization is also undergoing a bit of a transformation in regards to how the workforce is structured. Now I'm going to run you through a timeline of the remote work experience at Hesperian. In 2013, 100% of Hesperian staff worked in the office. Remote work was very rare, and it was only granted in extenuating circumstances such as illness, need to care for a parent or child, things like that. In 2015, the organization started to loosen its position on remote work, and 25% of Hesperian staff actually was working remotely in the year of 2015 for at least 20% of the week. People might have a work from home day, work from home a couple of afternoons a week, something along those lines. Come 2018, Hesperian is truly embracing a remote work model. 31% of Hesperian staff works remotely at least 20% of the week, and 12% of staff works remotely on a full-time basis, including the finance manager who is in Germany. There is another full-time contractor on the East Coast, and Hesperian is based on the West Coast. So there are definitely time zone challenges in addition to other problems. Now, in June 2018, in an attempt to respond to this period of organizational uncertainty, the Hesperian staff members and the board of directors met for a strategic planning meeting and conducted a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats analysis. The strengths and opportunities that the group of individuals identified include the ability to produce content in various digital formats for clients, as well as expanding the donor base and market in the United States. Traditionally, Hesperian's donor base and market has been targeted internationally, but we are beginning to see more interest in Hesperian's materials coming from organizations and individuals in the United States. Weaknesses and threats identified include the fact that unrestricted funds are very stressed, and we must assume that book sales for the organization will continue to decline. And so moving into our recommendations and discussion section of the presentation on how we can build successful remote teams through authentic leadership. Now, the goal here being develop authentic leadership for remote teams. So how can we do this? How can we make sure that remote employees are feeling a good amount of values congruence with their organization, that they are supported, that they are effective in their role? The first recommendation is to encourage reflection and clarity. From there, it is recommended to implement a KMS, a knowledge management system. Effective knowledge management systems will help remote teams communicate and collaborate, according to Sandra Heck's work in 2011. The organization needs to focus on building trust to have a successful remote work team. Employees who trust their direct supervisor will have a greater confidence in the organization and perform better, according to the research of Burn and Flood done in 2015. Finally, the organizations need to promote self-discipline, grant autonomy when possible to encourage remote workers to take ownership and stay motivated. Now that first recommendation, reflection and clarity. Everybody involved in an organization's efforts, remote work team or not, must have a strong shared value system because they're working on a similar shared purpose. Remote workers in disparate cultural, political, and social environments especially need to share in that value system to feel a sense of belonging to the work. They must sense a rich connection to the organizational values to retain a sense of purpose and motivation. This will drive individuals to produce quality work without oversight, to stay on their deadlines, and to properly use company resources in a remote and likely personal environment, seeing as 78% of remote workers do so from their home, according to the Buffer 2018 industry report. Bill George, the original contributor of the authentic leadership literature, argues that reflection and clarity are at the core of the authentic leader. Having a strong set of values only comes through clarity gained through regular reflection. The second recommendation provided is to introduce knowledge management systems. Now, 21% of remote employees named collaborating and communicating as the biggest challenge to working remotely. There are solutions that leadership can implement to ease the burden of collaboration and communication in a distance environment. Communication channels such as Slack allow employees to communicate in real time without clogging up inboxes and waiting for replies. It cuts down the need for meetings because people can provide real-time status updates on projects that they have questions about or are working on. Other collaborative software exists, such as GoToMeeting, Zoom, Google Docs for collaborative editing, and things like that. Now, leadership should intervene and make sure that they have these systems in place if they are going to be employing remote work teams. A knowledge management system will also allow remote workers to have a better understanding of what their employees' take on issues are, what their other employees have been working on, and where they may have left off on a document, and just generally reduce the need for duplication, reduce the need for questions, and allow people to be more effective and efficient in their workplace. The next recommendation is to build trust. A high degree of trust in leadership mediates common workplace issues of emotional exhaustion and work engagement, according to Byrne and Flood in their 2015 study. Another important scholar who contributed to the concept of building trust in terms of developing authentic leadership is Gene Schuyler. Schuyler describes common trends in leadership coaching that direct individuals to make sure they appear authentic at all times. She frames this as an oxymoron. How can one appear authentic? Shouldn't they just be authentic? More aptly, Schuyler argues that leaders develop a consistent image and never fail to market that image. Her analysis is highly relevant when business is deeply engaged with social media. However, the message to appear authentic is not entirely paradoxical. It serves as a reminder to leaders to constantly check in with their purpose and be sure they are leading according to values as opposed to external pressure. A leading scholar, Herminia Ibarra, also offered a criticism of authentic leadership, arguing that they are rigid and unwilling to budge from their sense of self. This analysis doesn't acknowledge the iterative, constant process authentic leaders undertake to assess their values and realign them with their environments, as espoused originally by Chan et al.'s phenomenological theory. Now, the next recommendation is to promote self-discipline, and this is critical to the success of any remote work team. As you can imagine, remote workers face a lot of distractions. They are working in a non-traditional office environment, and things such as children, pets, deliveries, any kind of home function that could be a distraction. 16% of remote workers report distractions at home as being one of the biggest problems with remote work. 14% of remote workers report trouble staying motivated. Again, this provides an opportunity for leadership to perform interventions on both of those things to increase the effectiveness of their remote employees. And encouraging those remote workers to have a highly defined self-concept will only be of benefit. It allows those employees to understand their purpose and their role in getting a job done, and to have a generally unified sense of self. A home-work balance is best achieved under these circumstances, according to research done by Kay Franzik on the subject, and it follows that effective remote workers need to have that balance to perform well out of a home office environment, where 78% of workers report as their primary location. So those are the recommendations I would make to organizations in terms of building and supporting remote work teams through authentic leadership. This slide provides an overview and summary of some of the issues that we have discussed during today's presentation. We'll begin with values. Now, remote workers with shared values will demonstrate more loyalty than under other leadership styles. What this means to say is that the authentic leadership is a master of conveying a shared sense of values. The authentic leader knows how to understand their own values and communicate them to their employees so that there is a sense of values congruence throughout the organization. And that is most likely to occur through authentic leadership. The next issue we will discuss is uncertainty. Like we've talked about during this presentation, remote work environments often face a lot of uncertainty. They are new, organizations are navigating new waters, and the work itself can be rather ambiguous. There is a lot of questions in the air that a remote worker needs to feel confident and capable responding to. They don't need to know the answers, but they need to feel confident in the face of uncertainty. Now, another category that we talked about today about authentic leadership is that it's really a low-hanging fruit. Through the studies that compared the sense of traditional African leadership models with servant leadership, which the author then paralleled with authentic leadership in some senses, we can see that authentic leadership is natural. It mirrors several traditional models of leadership, and it makes sense to people. It makes sense to be their authentic selves when they are leading. Finally, we discussed reflection and its centrality to authentic leadership. Remote work teams need an internal sense of direction that motivates them to complete their tasks. Authentic leadership provides a venue for reflection in one's daily work. So I hope that this gave a good sense of why authentic leadership is the most effective way to lead, build, and support remote work teams. As remote work becomes a more commonplace establishment for many organizations, we will see the role of authentic leadership rising. Authentic leadership will not just be held by those with a leadership title, but it will also be exhibited and demonstrated by employees across the organization. Authentic leaders need to have this sense of values and this sense of self-discipline that is also required of remote workers. So I think there will start to be a meshing of leadership as organizations become more flat and dispersed with more remote workers. Each of those remote workers will be held more accountable for their product, will be held more accountable for their time. Remote workers do not work as traditional hours as people do in the office. They do not take as much vacation. They're more or less constantly plugged in. So we're going to see a lot more disbursement of leadership, and it will be authentic leadership across an organization. Everybody's going to need to understand their own passion, their own values, their own reason for continuing to work, even in the face of distraction, even in the face of uncertainty. So this paper has recommended a understanding of authentic leadership across an organization, not just with the top leadership. So I want to thank you very much, Dr. Sanchez, classmates. This has been an enjoyable experience, and I appreciate your listening to my presentation. Thank you.